It was supposed to be just another boring Saturday afternoon. I had reluctantly agreed to help my mom clean out my grandparents' old house after they passed away earlier that year. Their home, a sprawling Victorian-style cottage nestled at the edge of town, had always felt like a relic from another era, filled with creaky floorboards, dusty furniture, and faded photographs lining the walls. It seemed frozen in time. But as much as I dreaded spending hours sorting through decades-old junk, nothing could have prepared me for what I would uncover in the attic that day. A discovery so shocking it would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family. As we pulled up to the house, the air carried the faint scent of autumn leaves mixed with damp wood. It wasn't hard to see why this place held such sentimental value for our family. My grandparents had lived here their entire lives, raising 3 children, including my mother, and filling every corner of the house with memories. Yet now, standing before its weathered facade, it felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Inside, the living room still smelled faintly of lavender potpourri, a scent my grandmother loved. Boxes were stacked haphazardly against the walls, labeled hastily in black marker. Christmas decorations, photo albums, kitchenware. Mom handed me a pair of gloves and nodded toward the staircase leading upstairs. "Start with the attic," she said. "There's not much up there, but we need to clear it out." I groaned inwardly. Of course, I got stuck with the creepy attic. Armed with a flashlight and a vague sense of dread, I climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under my weight. When I finally pushed open the heavy wooden door, a cloud of dust greeted me, swirling around like ghosts disturbed from their slumber. At first glance, the attic appeared unremarkable. Old trunks lined one wall, while stacks of yellowed newspapers and forgotten knickknacks cluttered the rest of the space. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the room. I sighed and began rummaging through the nearest trunk, finding nothing but moth-eaten sweaters and outdated magazines. But then, tucked away in the farthest corner, I spotted something unusual: a small, locked wooden box. Unlike the other items, which were covered in layers of grime, this box looked almost pristine, as if someone had taken great care to preserve it. Intrigued, I picked it up and examined it closely. There was no keyhole, only a combination lock etched with numbers worn smooth by time. "Mom!" I called down the stairs, my voice echoing through the empty house. "Do you know anything about this?" She joined me moments later, her brow furrowing as she studied the box. "No idea," she admitted. "I've never seen it before. Maybe it belonged to your grandfather? He used to collect odd things." Frustrated but determined, I decided to try cracking the code myself. After several failed attempts, I noticed something peculiar: a series of faint scratches near the dial. They looked deliberate, almost like clues. Following my gut instinct, I entered the sequence of numbers corresponding to the scratches. To my astonishment, the lid clicked open. Inside, I found a collection of letters tied together with a faded ribbon, along with a stack of Polaroid photographs. My heart raced as I unfolded the topmost letter. Written in elegant cursive handwriting was a name I didn't recognize: Eleanor Hartley. Beneath it, the words "Confessions of a Lifetime" sent chills down my spine. Curiosity overtook caution, and I began reading aloud. The first few lines painted a picture of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, desperate for freedom. As I continued, however, the tone shifted dramatically. Eleanor spoke of forbidden affairs, betrayal, and secrets buried deep within the fabric of our family history. One passage stood out above all others: "They will never understand the sacrifices I made, the child I gave up, the lies I told to protect them. If these pages are ever discovered, may God forgive me." My hands trembled as I set the letter aside and turned my attention to the photographs. Each image depicted scenes from what appeared to be the 1950s or 60s. A young couple smiling happily outside a church, a baby cradled in arms, a group of friends gathered around a picnic table. But one photo stopped me cold. In it, a woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to my grandmother stood beside a man I didn't recognize. Scrawled on the back in shaky handwriting were the words, "Eleanor and James, Summer 1962. Overwhelmed, I brought the box downstairs to show my mom. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. She gasped, her face draining of color as she stared at the contents. "Where did you find this?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the attic," I replied cautiously. "Do you know who Eleanor is?" For a long moment, she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the letters and photographs. Then, with a heavy sigh, she sank into a nearby chair. "Eleanor was your grandmother's sister," she explained slowly. "But no one talks about her anymore. She disappeared when I was very young, and your grandfather forbade us from mentioning her name." The revelation hit me like a ton of bricks. My grandmother had a sister? Why had no one ever told me? And what had happened to her? Determined to get answers, I pressed my mom for details. Reluctantly, she recounted fragments of a story she herself barely understood. According to family lore, Eleanor had been involved in some kind of scandal, a scandal so severe that it tore the family apart. Rumors swirled about an affair, a pregnancy out of wedlock, and even accusations of theft. Whatever the truth, Eleanor vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers and unanswered questions. That night, unable to sleep, I returned to the attic armed with fresh determination. If there were more clues hidden among my grandparents' belongings, I intended to find them. Hours passed as I sifted through boxes, drawers, and forgotten corners, piecing together fragments of the past. In an old filing cabinet, I stumbled upon a stack of legal documents dated 1963. Among them was a birth certificate for a baby girl named Sarah Hartley, born to Eleanor Hartley and listed as father unknown. Another document revealed that Sarah had been placed for adoption shortly after her birth. My mind reeled as I connected the dots. Could Sarah be alive today? Did she even know she had a family searching for her? Driven by a mix of guilt and curiosity, I decided to track her down. Using online databases and public records, I painstakingly traced Sarah's adoptive family, eventually locating her obituary. She had died tragically young in a car accident, but not before marrying and having 2 children of her own. For the first time, I realized the ripple effect of Eleanor's choices. Her decision to give up her daughter hadn't just impacted her own life. It had shaped generations to come. When I shared my findings with my mom, she broke down in tears. "Your grandfather always blamed Eleanor for ruining the family," she confessed. "But maybe he was wrong. Maybe she was just trying to survive." Together, we decided to honor Eleanor's memory by sharing her story. We reached out to distant relatives who might remember her, piecing together a fuller picture of her life. What emerged was a portrait of a brave, flawed woman caught between societal expectations and her own desires. Though her choices had painful consequences, they also reflected a quiet resilience that resonated deeply with me. As days turned into weeks, I became consumed by the need to understand Eleanor's world. I scoured libraries for local newspapers from the 1960s, hoping to find any mention of her. It wasn't until I stumbled upon a yellowed article in a small-town publication that I began to piece together the full scope of the scandal. The headline read, "Local woman accused of embezzlement amid family feud." Below it was a grainy photograph of Eleanor, her expression defiant despite the accusations against her. The article detailed how Eleanor had worked as a secretary for a prominent businessman in town. When large sums of money went missing from his accounts, suspicion fell squarely on her shoulders. Though she vehemently denied the charges, the damage was done. Her reputation was ruined, and her family disowned her, unwilling to associate with someone accused of such disgraceful behavior. Yet as I read further, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. The timeline didn't align perfectly, and certain details seemed deliberately vague. Was it possible that Eleanor had been framed? Or had she truly committed the crime and fled to escape justice? Determined to uncover the truth, I tracked down the last known address of the businessman mentioned in the article. To my surprise, his grandson still lived in the same house. Hesitant but hopeful, I knocked on the door. An elderly man answered, his eyes narrowing suspiciously as I introduced myself. "I'm looking for information about Eleanor Hartley," I said carefully. She worked for your grandfather many years ago. The man's expression softened slightly. Eleanor, he murmured, shaking his head. Poor woman. My grandfather always regretted what happened to her. What do you mean? I asked, my pulse quickening. He gestured for me to sit on the porch steps, then launched into a tale that left me breathless. According to him, his grandfather had indeed suspected Eleanor of embezzling funds, but not because he believed she was guilty. Instead, he feared that implicating her would draw attention away from the real culprit. His business partner, who had been skimming money for years. Faced with mounting evidence and pressure from investors, he chose to sacrifice Eleanor rather than risk exposing his partner. He carried that guilt to his grave, the man concluded sadly. He often wondered if Eleanor ever forgave him. Stunned, I thanked him for sharing the story and returned home, my mind racing. For the first time, I saw Eleanor not as a villain or victim, but as a complex human being caught in circumstances beyond her control. Her decisions, though difficult and painful, had been driven by survival and love. And yet, the consequences of those decisions had rippled through generations, shaping lives in ways she could never have imagined. That evening, I sat down with my mom and shared everything I had learned. Together, we pored over the letters and photographs once more, seeing them in a new light. Each word, each image, told a story of resilience and sacrifice. A story that deserved to be remembered, not erased. We need to tell everyone, I said firmly. Not just our family, but anyone who will listen. Eleanor deserves to be understood, not judged. My mom nodded, tears streaming down her face. You're right. It's time we stopped hiding from the past. And so, we began the process of reclaiming Eleanor's legacy. We organized a family gathering, inviting distant relatives and friends who might have known her. We created a scrapbook filled with her letters, photographs, and the stories we had uncovered. Slowly but surely, Eleanor's name ceased to be a source of shame and became a symbol of strength and forgiveness. The day of the family gathering arrived, and I felt a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. We had invited everyone we could think of, cousins, aunts, uncles, even old neighbors who might have known Eleanor. The house buzzed with nervous energy as people trickled in, carrying plates of food and bottles of wine. It was the first time in years that so many members of our extended family had come together under one roof. I stood at the front of the living room, clutching the wooden box tightly in my hands. My mom sat nearby, her eyes red from crying but filled with quiet determination. As the chatter died down and all eyes turned to me, I took a deep breath and began to speak. I know this is unusual, I started, my voice trembling slightly. But today isn't just about catching up or reminiscing about the past. Today, we're here to talk about someone whose name has been absent from our conversations for far too long, Eleanor Hartley. A murmur rippled through the room. Some faces registered shock, others confusion, and a few looked visibly uncomfortable. I pressed on, opening the box and holding up the letters and photographs. These belonged to Eleanor. They were hidden in the attic for decades, waiting to be found. What they reveal? Well, it changes everything we thought we knew about our family. For the next hour, I shared Eleanor's story. The scandal, the accusations, the adoption of her daughter, Sarah, and the heartbreaking decision to leave her family behind. I recounted the discoveries I had made, including the businessman's grandson's revelation about the true culprit behind the embezzlement scheme. With each word, I watched as the weight of the past lifted from some shoulders while settling heavily on others. When I finished speaking, there was a long silence. Then, an older woman in the back of the room stood up. She introduced herself as Margaret, a childhood friend of Eleanor's. Her voice cracked with emotion as she began to share her own memories. Eleanor was kind, Margaret said softly. She always put others before herself. When her husband left her, she didn't tell anyone how much it hurt because she didn't want to burden us. And when the rumors started spreading, God, it broke my heart to see what they did to her. Margaret's words opened the floodgates. One by one, people began sharing fragments of Eleanor's life, stories of her laughter, her generosity, her quiet strength. A cousin revealed that Eleanor had once sent money anonymously to help pay for his college tuition. An uncle admitted that he'd overheard his parents arguing about her disappearance, but had been too young to understand at the time. Each memory added another layer to the portrait of a woman who had been misunderstood and unfairly judged. As the evening wore on, something remarkable happened. The tension that had lingered in the air began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of unity and purpose. For the first time, our family wasn't running from its history, it was embracing it. We laughed, we cried, and we promised to keep Eleanor's memory alive. After the gathering, I couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, Eleanor's daughter. Though she had passed away, her children were still out there somewhere. I decided to reach out to them, hoping to connect the final pieces of the puzzle. After weeks of searching, I finally tracked down Sarah's son, Daniel, and arranged to meet him at a cafe in the city. Daniel was hesitant at first, understandably wary of a stranger claiming to be related to him. But as I showed him the letters, photographs, and documents, his skepticism gave way to awe. He listened intently as I explained who Eleanor was and how she had sacrificed so much to give him and his sister a chance at a better life. By the end of our meeting, Daniel was in tears. "I never knew any of this," he said, shaking his head. "My mom never talked about her past. She always said she wanted to protect us from the pain she'd been through. But now I feel like I finally understand where I come from." We exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch. Over the following months, Daniel and I worked together to piece together more of Eleanor's story. He shared memories of his mother, Sarah, painting a picture of a woman who had struggled but ultimately thrived despite the challenges she faced. Together, we created a digital archive, a tribute to Eleanor and the generations she had unknowingly touched. Back home, the transformation within our family continued. Conversations that had once been taboo became opportunities for growth and understanding. My mom, in particular, seemed lighter, as if shedding the burden of secrecy had freed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She began writing letters to Eleanor, pouring out her thoughts and feelings as a way of processing everything we had uncovered. One afternoon, as we sorted through the last of the attic boxes, I found a small journal tucked inside a trunk. Its pages were filled with my grandmother's handwriting, poems, reflections, and entries detailing her grief over losing Eleanor. In one entry, she wrote, "I miss her every day. Not a single moment passes without wondering where she is, if she's safe, if she thinks of me too. I wish I could turn back time and make things right, but I can't. All I can do is hope that someday, somehow, the truth will come to light." Reading those words brought tears to my eyes. It was as if my grandmother had been reaching out across the years, urging us to find the courage to confront the past. I realized then that uncovering Eleanor's story wasn't just about justice or closure. It was about honoring the love that had endured despite everything. In the weeks that followed, I started documenting our journey. I wrote essays, recorded interviews with family members, and even filmed short videos exploring different aspects of Eleanor's life. Slowly but surely, her story began to gain traction online. People from all over reached out, sharing their own experiences of family secrets and reconciliation. What had begun as a personal quest had evolved into something much larger, a testament to the power of truth and forgiveness. As Eleanor's story gained attention online, I found myself overwhelmed by the response. Messages poured in from strangers who had stumbled upon my posts, some sharing their own tales of hidden family secrets, others expressing gratitude for shedding light on a topic so often shrouded in shame. One woman wrote to say that reading about Eleanor had inspired her to confront her own mother about an adoption she'd never fully understood. Another man described how he'd spent years estranged from his sibling over a perceived betrayal, only to realize after reading my essays that forgiveness might still be possible. The outpouring of support was humbling, but it also reinforced something I'd begun to suspect. Eleanor's story wasn't just hers. It belonged to anyone who had ever felt silenced, misunderstood, or abandoned by those they loved most. Her courage in facing impossible choices resonated deeply with people, offering them a mirror to reflect on their own lives. Yet, as uplifting as these connections were, they also forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about myself. For years, I had prided myself on being the responsible one in my family, the person everyone could count on to keep things running smoothly. But in reality, I had been avoiding conflict, burying emotions beneath layers of practicality and routine. Uncovering Eleanor's secret had cracked open not just my family's past but also my own carefully constructed facade. I began seeing parallels between Eleanor's life and my own. Like her, I had made sacrifices, not out of necessity, but out of fear. Fear of confrontation, fear of vulnerability, fear of disrupting the fragile balance I thought held our family together. Helping piece together her story taught me that sometimes breaking things apart is the only way to build something stronger. One evening, as I sat at my desk reviewing old photographs and letters, my mom knocked softly on the door. She looked hesitant, almost nervous, as she stepped inside. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. "Of course," I replied, gesturing for her to sit down. She hesitated before speaking, choosing her words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said earlier, that keeping Eleanor's story hidden didn't protect us. It hurt us, and I think you're right." Her admission caught me off guard. My mom had always been fiercely private, rarely discussing emotions or personal struggles. Seeing her vulnerable like this was both unsettling and deeply moving. "I know I haven't always been the best at talking about things," she continued. "Your grandfather, he believed silence was strength. He thought if we ignored the pain it would go away. But it doesn't. It just festers." Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached across the table to take my hand. "Thank you for finding Eleanor, for giving her back to us, and for showing me that it's okay to let go of the past." We sat there for a long time, holding hands and saying nothing. In that moment, I realized how much we had both grown. Not just individually, but together. By confronting Eleanor's legacy, we had begun to heal wounds that had lingered for decades. Inspired by this breakthrough, I decided to take things a step further. With Daniel's blessing, I reached out to local historians and archivists, hoping to preserve Eleanor's story in a more permanent way. Together, we organized an exhibit at the town museum, showcasing photographs, letters, and artifacts from her life. The opening night drew a crowd far larger than I had anticipated. Friends, relatives, neighbors, and even descendants of the businessman involved in the scandal. Standing in front of the display, I watched as people moved through the room, pausing to read captions and examine items behind glass cases. Some nodded knowingly, recognizing familiar names or faces. Others wiped away tears, visibly moved by the humanity of Eleanor's plight. When it was my turn to speak, I felt a surge of pride. Not for myself, but for the woman whose voice had finally been heard. "This isn't just Eleanor's story," I told the audience. "It's ours." It's a reminder that none of us are defined solely by our mistakes or the circumstances we find ourselves in. We are shaped by the choices we make, yes, but also by the love and resilience that carry us through. Afterward, several attendees approached me to share their thoughts. A young woman thanked me for highlighting the importance of forgiveness, while an elderly man recounted his own experience of reconciling with a sibling after decades of estrangement. Each conversation deepened my belief that stories have the power to connect us, to remind us of our shared humanity. In the months that followed, I continued working on projects inspired by Eleanor's legacy. I collaborated with Daniel to write a book chronicling her life, weaving together historical research, family anecdotes, and reflections on the themes of identity and belonging. The process was cathartic, allowing me to channel my emotions into something tangible and meaningful. But perhaps the greatest reward came closer to home. Our family dynamic shifted in subtle yet profound ways. Conversations became more open, relationships more authentic. Even distant relatives who had once drifted apart reconnected, united by a newfound appreciation for the ties that bound us. One day, while sorting through the last remnants of my grandparents' belongings, I stumbled upon a small, framed photograph tucked inside a drawer. It showed Eleanor standing alone on a windswept beach, her hair blowing wildly around her face. On the back, written in faint pencil, were the words, To whoever finds this, remember me. I stared at the image for a long time, feeling an ache in my chest that wasn't entirely sadness. It was gratitude for Eleanor, for the journey she had led me on, and for the lessons she had taught me about love, loss, and redemption. Today, the wooden box sits proudly displayed in my home, a testament to the power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit. Uncovering Eleanor's secret didn't destroy us. It brought us closer together. By confronting the past, we learned to embrace imperfection and celebrate the strength it takes to move forward. And as for Eleanor, her story serves as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is light waiting to be found. As time passed, Eleanor's story continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways I never could have imagined. The book Daniel and I co-authored became a local bestseller, sparking discussions at book clubs, schools, and community events. People were drawn not just to the historical details but to the universal themes of love, sacrifice, and redemption. It was as if Eleanor's voice, once silenced, had found new life through the pages we had written. One particularly memorable event took place at the library where I had spent countless hours researching Eleanor's past. The librarian invited me to host a Q&A session after a reading, and I agreed, expecting a modest turnout. Instead, the room overflowed with attendees, young and old, familiar faces and strangers alike. As I answered questions about the writing process and the discoveries we had made, I noticed a young girl sitting near the front, clutching a worn notebook. When the session ended, she approached me shyly, her cheeks flushed. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly. "My mom left when I was little, and I always thought it was because of something I did. But hearing about Eleanor, it made me realize that sometimes people make hard choices because they think it's the only way to protect the ones they love." Her words stayed with me long after the event ended. They reminded me that stories don't just entertain, they heal. And while I couldn't change what had happened to Eleanor or undo the pain her absence had caused, I could help others find solace in knowing they weren't alone. Back home, I began to notice subtle changes within myself. For so long, I had defined my worth by my ability to keep things together, to maintain order in a chaotic world. But uncovering Eleanor's secret had taught me that true strength lies in embracing vulnerability, in allowing yourself to feel deeply and authentically. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since childhood, pouring my thoughts onto paper without fear of judgment. It felt liberating, like shedding layers of armor I no longer needed. My relationship with my mom also deepened in unexpected ways. We began taking long walks together, talking about everything from childhood memories to future dreams. She shared stories about her own struggles, things she had kept bottled up for years, and I listened without interrupting, savoring the intimacy of those moments. In turn, I opened up about my fears and insecurities, realizing that vulnerability wasn't a weakness but a bridge connecting us to each other. One afternoon, as we strolled through the park near her house, she stopped suddenly and turned to face me. "You know," she said, her voice tinged with emotion, "I used to think your grandfather was right. That silence protected us, but now I see how wrong he was. You've shown me that speaking the truth doesn't break us. It sets us free." Her words brought tears to my eyes. For so long, I had carried the weight of our family's secrets, believing it was my responsibility to shield everyone from pain. But now, standing there with my mom, I understood that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making peace with it. In the weeks that followed, I decided to revisit the attic one last time. Though most of its contents had been sorted and distributed, I felt drawn to the space where it all began. Climbing the creaky staircase, I pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through the small window, illuminating dust motes swirling lazily in the air. I walked to the far corner where I had found the wooden box and knelt down, running my fingers over the floorboards. Something about the act felt symbolic, a way of closing the chapter that had changed my life forever. As I sat there, I thought about Eleanor and the choices she had made. She hadn't been perfect, but neither was anyone else. Her imperfections were what made her human, what made her story resonate so deeply with others. Before leaving, I placed a single Polaroid photograph on the floor, the one of Eleanor standing on the beach, her hair whipping around her face. On the back, I wrote, "We remember you." Months later, I received an email from Daniel. Attached was a photograph of his children, Eleanor's great-grandchildren, standing in front of the town museum exhibit. They were smiling brightly, their arms wrapped around each other as they posed beside a display case containing some of Eleanor's letters and photographs. In the background, I could see visitors milling about, reading captions and discussing the artifacts. "I thought you'd like to see this," Daniel wrote in the email. "The kids wanted to come after hearing so much about their great-great-aunt. They said she feels like part of the family now." Tears welled up in my eyes as I stared at the image. It was a poignant reminder of how far we had come, from silence and shame to celebration and connection. Eleanor's legacy wasn't just preserved in books or exhibits. It lived on in the hearts of those who carried her memory forward. That evening, I sat down with my mom to watch the sunset from her porch. The sky blazed with hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the yard. We didn't speak much, content to simply sit together in companionable silence. But as the light began to fade, she reached over and took my hand. "You've done something incredible," she said softly. "Not just for our family, but for everyone who needed to hear Eleanor's story. You've given us all a gift." Her words filled me with a quiet sense of pride. Not because I had uncovered a secret or written a book, but because I had helped mend something broken. Healing isn't linear, I realized. It's messy and imperfect, full of setbacks and small victories. But it's also beautiful, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Later that night, I pulled out the wooden box one last time. Inside, alongside the letters and photographs, I placed a note of my own. On it, I wrote, "To Eleanor, thank you for teaching me that love endures, even in the face of loss. Your courage has changed us all." Closing the lid, I set the box on a shelf in my living room, where it would remain as a reminder of the journey we had taken and the lessons we had learned along the way. In the weeks and months that followed, life returned to its usual rhythm. Work deadlines loomed, social plans filled the calendar, and the attic at my grandparents' house grew quiet once more. Yet the impact of Eleanor's story lingered, woven into the fabric of our daily lives. Conversations flowed more freely, laughter rang louder, and the weight of unspoken truths no longer hung heavy in the air. One day, while flipping through old photo albums, I came across a picture of my grandmother as a young woman. She stood beside a tree, her expression soft and contemplative. For the first time, I saw traces of Eleanor in her features, the same determined gaze, the same quiet resilience. It struck me then that perhaps Eleanor hadn't been entirely lost after all. Her spirit had lived on, not just in stories and memories, but in the people who loved her. As I closed the album, I felt a deep sense of peace. Uncovering Eleanor's secret hadn't erased the pain of the past, nor had it provided all the answers I sought. But it had done something far more important. It had reminded me that we are shaped not by the secrets we keep, but by the truths we choose to embrace. And so, Eleanor's story became more than just a tale of betrayal and redemption. It became a testament to the enduring power of love. Love that survives despite separation. Love that forgives even when it hurts. Love that connects us across generations, bridging gaps we never thought could be crossed. Today, whenever I feel overwhelmed by life's challenges, I think of Eleanor standing on that windswept beach, her hair blowing wildly around her face. I imagine her looking out at the horizon, knowing that whatever storms lay ahead, she had faced them with courage and grace. Because in the end, that's what matters most. Not the secrets we uncover, but the strength we find within ourselves to confront them. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we discover that the hardest journeys lead us back to where we belong, to the people who make us whole. The end.